Welcome to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth, and we're here to preserve and promote culture in this benighted age, one weekly conversation at a time. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show through iTunes or by plugging our RSS feed into your favorite podcatcher. You can find the RSS feed on our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/vm. We're also on Twitter and Instagram at vmspod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on Spotify, YouTube, and tunein.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And visit patreon.com/vmspod or paypal.me/vmspod to make a one-time or recurring donation and help me continue to produce smart conversation about books, art, comics, and culture every week at the Virtual Memories Show. I decided to take yesterday off from my daily podcast posting regimen, and it seems like a smart move. I got in a great run first thing in the morning, hauled a stack of comic books out of the cavern of long boxes after I got back, and just chilled out for most of the day, reading The Invisibles and not looking at download stats or Twitter or much anything else. It was kind of nice to decompress like that and get a skip day out of the way early in a month. It's a good way to not pressure myself later in the month when I don't have a daily guest lined up because I screwed up a scheduling and I feel like I'm going to break some sort of compulsive streak and put this weird pressure on myself, even though it's just a friggin' podcast. In fact, I recorded a segment on a friend's business podcast last week. I'll let you know when that posts. And he asked me how my wife would describe me in 3 words. And without hesitating, I said, obsessive compulsive disorder. And that was that. Anyway, let's get on with the show. My guest this week is Paul C. Tumey. Paul is the author of the new book, Screwball, The Cartoonists Who Made the Funnies Funny, from IDW. Screwball contains a series of profiles of some of the greats of newspaper cartooning who had a certain comedic sensibility of, well, screwballism, as Paul puts it. Screwball and screwballism is a bit, you know it when you see it, but it, to be blunt, entails a off-the-wall sense of humor, kind of grotesque or exaggerated characters and situations, and a willingness to dive off the deep end of absurdism. It's got plops. It's got responses to comedy where somebody literally just blows through a wall in shock and all that. You know, the over-the-top screwball comedy. Anyway, the book is well-researched, well-written, and features a ton of strips by his subjects, really exploring their humor and its place in American culture from around the turn of the century through World War II and beyond. And the ways in which the screwball comedy of their strips kind of intersects with vaudeville and film as it's being developed. He really does a neat job of integrating all that stuff while giving you these really human stories about the 15 screwball cartoonists who are profiled within it. Anyway, I enjoyed the heck out of Screwball, especially because those profiles balanced between guys I had some knowledge of, like George Harriman and Rube Goldberg and E.C. Segar, with others I didn't know at all because I'm a moron, like Frederick Opper, Bill Holman, Walter Bradford, and a bunch more. So really good book, opens you up to a new world. The comics that are reproduced in it are fantastic. The reproduction looks great, and it's a really interesting array of their work. And for me, and we talk about it a little bit, there's a segment where I'm thinking, that's very similar to Harvey Kurtzman's work just a few years after this period, and seeing it and how it kind of feeds into the lineage of comedy. It's a really interesting document, a really great way of kind of bringing that history forth while keeping it funny. Anyway, Michael Tisserand, the biographer of George Harriman, I did a book called Crazy, which we did an interview about, 4 years ago. Anyway, he turned me on to Paul's work, and Paul and I decided that he would be my first new guest of the pandemic era, which means We recorded this one remotely. As far as caveats go, not much outside of the fact that we did remote recording, so his voice is going to sound a little modulated. Oh, and when he mentions Yoshiharu Tsuge, he actually meant Abisu Yoshikazu. I mix them up all the time, too. Here's Paul's bio. Paul C. Tumey is a writer and artist in Seattle, Washington. He was nominated for an Eisner Award as co-editor of Foolish Questions and Other Odd Observations by Rube Goldberg, co-edited and wrote for The Art of Rube Goldberg, and wrote the introduction for the Legends of American Comics, LOAC, Essentials, The Bungle Family and Thimble Theater, and the pre-Popeye cartoons of E.C. Segar. He writes a column for the Comics Journal. And now, the Virtual Memories conversation with Paul C. Tumey. I'm hoping this will be perfectly fine. The ones I've done in the past month and a half have been with past guests. So this is the very first time I'm sitting down with someone I've never spoken to before on a remote. So
I'm honored.
And we thank... Oh, sorry. Go on.
I'm
honored. And that's
honored.
exactly the sort of thing I'm worried about happening, us talking over each other.
Yeah, I'm bad about that. I'll try to be...
Oh, people are here to hear you, not me. So I may as well start with the basic question. When Screwball? Where did the concept begin for you? The book, what is Screwball as it comes about? But tell me about the origins of the book for you.
Well, it sort of grew out of another blog that I created called Cole's Comics, which is still available on the internet. And there's about 225 articles devoted to the work of Jack Cole. Are you familiar with that cartoonist at all?
Oh, I'm plastic manned up. That was my old, my old idol. Mostly because of the goggles and the, the corset like costume and stuff. But anyway, go on. Yeah.
Yeah. So,
and the suicide. Don't get me wrong. The suicide's also an appeal, but yeah.
Yeah, indeed. That blog wasn't, done over the course of many years. And I explored every nook and cranny of his career that I could, although I have found some new stuff that I'm actually preparing into a new book that'll be hopefully coming out in a few months.
Oh, good.
But I developed a sort of a way to create a critical framework studying the life and work of an artist, and how do you create a biography of an artist when they were never interviewed, and nobody in the family wants to talk about it, and there isn't much information. So this blog, naturally, I began to wonder what were the influences on Jack Cole. If for people out there who don't know his work, he created Plastic Man, among many other great comics in the 1940s. And Plastic Man is this great, almost lampoon of a superhero, created almost at the birth of the superhero form. And Plastic Man can stretch himself into any shape. He can massage his face into any face. He changes gender quite a lot. And it's just the goofiest, wackiest comics that comic book stories that I've ever read. And they have a unique flavor, as you would probably attest to, Gil.
Sure.
And so it's like, where did he get this wacky sense of humor? It's a wonderful merging of the superhero concept with something else, like more like Marx Brothers humor. Where did that come from? So the internet began to post archives of old newspapers, and they had an archive of his hometown newspaper, the Newcastle News. So I looked at what he must have read in the comic strips when he was growing up in Newcastle, Pennsylvania. And you have Smokey Stover in there. You've got Gene Ahern. You've got Rube Goldberg. And that started me down the path. And one day I realized I had more or less written everything I could about Jack Cole. So where do I go next? And it came to me one day. It was a cold morning in February. And out of the blue, I just thought, Screwball Comics. Now, there was an issue of a great magazine called Nemo, which was published by Richard Marshall, edited by Richard Marshall. And it's just full of great articles about the great American comic strips. And he did an oversized one annual issue, which was about Screwball Comics. And as far as I know, he gets the credit for sort of naming this genre retroactively. And I can't tell you off the top of my head I was looking in my book when that came out. I think it was the late 70s or maybe early 80s. Anyway, so I just decided to build on that and started a blog. And the first question was, what is Screwball and who would be the Screwball cartoonist? Like would Blondie be a Screwball strip? Immediate reaction in my gut would be no. It might have some Screwball moments, but it's not ostensibly wild and crazy like a Marx Brothers movie or like Plastic Man. So I just intuitively found my way into these cartoonists and who they might be, and picked some and began to write about them and accumulate lots and lots of biographical tidbits and details by researching newspaper archives and magazine archives and anything I could find. And I've discovered that framing the old newspaper comics through the lens of Screwball opened up a new way to read these things and to give them some context and continuity. And that led to this project, this book.
And what was that transition? And how would you define not Screwball itself, but how it helps you put that style of humor in context? And what ultimately is it a response to? Why did Screwball develop, I guess?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I discussed this in the introduction of the book briefly. I think this, my theory is that Screwball Comics emerged in response to a few factors that were happening in the world at the turn of the 20th century. The form actually starts in magazines, believe it or not newspaper comics. And in the late 1880s, you had an explosion of graphics in magazines due to an innovation in printing technology, where they went from laboriously cutting cartoons out in wood and printing them in rather fuzzy reprints. And, it just took enormous amounts of labor to do that. And they figured out a way to just use acid and etch into metal plates. And you could suddenly have a lot more graphics in your magazine. And that led to magazines like Puck and Judge coming into existence. And that there were so many others. I mean, there was a ton of them. And this is a sort of an undocumented part of comics history that I hope someday somebody, maybe me, shines more light on it. But I learned about it enough to see that this is kind of where it all started. So you had people like Frederick Opper and Eugene Zimmerman doing their political cartoons, but then they began to start a second stream of humor cartoons. And the humor cartoons focused on things that were happening in society, like the rise of women's status in society. And, this was when the suffragette movement began to happen. And so there were social changes, huge social changes, at least in America. And there was also a rapid acceleration of technology as the industrial age began to just go crazy. And everything had a gadget or a machine. The patents in the early part of the 20th century, exponentially multiplied, and there were just machines for doing everything. And so, you have someone like Rube Goldberg or Claire Victor Dwiggins doing all of these great parodies of overly complicated inventions to accomplish ridiculously simple tasks like turning on a light switch. although they didn't have light switches back then. But so it would be like licking a stamp, for example, or cranking your flivver. I think to sort of try to answer your question, I think screwballism emerges from the pressures of society changing, the pressures of technology developing rapidly and changing people's lives, and also the generation that embraced screwball as a form of humor in the popular arts was enduring World War I, a devastating war. Right after that, in 1918 and 1919, they had their own COVID-19, the Spanish flu. And right now we're all getting an insight, 100 years later into what that must have been like for those people. And imagine they were coming out of a world war. And then they skidded into the Great Depression, and then they slammed right into World War II. So there was a heck of a lot that people had to deal with. And it's my theory that in the newspapers, at least, the headlines and the front section stories were so darn serious and disturbing, sort of like the news is today, frankly, when you read it, that people needed a tonic. And so the comics became very important for providing some levity and relief. And in fact, in my book, I quote the great comic Stan Laurel, one half of the Laurel and Hardy comics team, film comedy team. And Stan in 1934 said, "Humor in any form is one of the finest tonics for depression, whether the depressed be an individual or a nation. The comic pages of America have done their part in lifting this country out of the dumps and bringing smiles to the haggard face of a worried world." And now I didn't understand. I knew all along the universe wanted me to write this book, and it took 7 years to write it. And it just so happens that a few months after the book was published, we're now, you could say, a haggard world.
Yeah. Except now instead of Screwball, we have Tiger King. But
yeah, exactly. Yeah. Which is pretty screwy.
So I've heard. I've avoided watching it so far. And of all the guests I've recorded with during all these COVID check-ins, the most surprising one who focused on that was a biblical scholar a couple of days ago who managed to tie that into his scholarship. I'm like, I really did not expect Tiger King to be a center of this conversation of all. I thought a bunch of cartoonists would focus on that, but whatever. That's cool. So,
I have to confess, I haven't read it. Not read it. I haven't watched it either.
Well, again, the longer this goes on, same here, but the longer this goes on, I'm sure our resistance will wear down.
Yeah.
No, what was the biggest challenges, I guess, in terms of research, finding material, and then also selecting the particular cartoonists that you focused on for the book?
Oh, God, Gil, it was like there was so little. There's a few cartoonists in the book. There's 15 cartoonists covered in my book, and a few of them are well known, like E.C. Segar and George Harriman. We have Michael Tisserand's great 500-plus page biography of George Harriman. And there's Rube Goldberg. In 1970, a great biography of Rube Goldberg was published. And then I think in about 2013, if I remember right, Abrams Comic Arts put out a wonderful coffee table book filled with information about Rube Goldberg called The Art of Rube Goldberg. And I was co-editor of that and heavily involved in the creation of that book. So there were some places you could go to get some information about some of these guys, but most of it, the biggest challenge was just research, which I loved. It was like an incredible treasure hunt. I can't tell you the charges that I would get when I would discover what I knew to be a key piece of information or a great, colorful story about one of my guys, like finding a story about Gene Ahern, the cartoonist who did The Squirrel Cage in Our Boarding House, and finding a story in his own words in an interview where he talks about riding an elevated train in Chicago, and he boards it, and he sees sitting on a seat otherwise empty next to a custard pie. and he decides to go sit on it, enacting a silent comedy in real life. And he said the guy was really sore, the pie owner, but the man across the aisle roared with laughter and offered him a job. This was a great, and that job turned out to be his entrance into becoming a professional artist. This was a great story to find. So the hardest part, though, was digging all this stuff up. It took countless hours, searching through online archives. But the great thing is, and this is sort of something, I think we're in comics history 2.0 right now, because so much material is now available on the internet. Used to, if you wanted to research something obscure like this that hadn't been very well documented before, you'd have to actually physically travel to different libraries. You could get some interlibrary loans, but you would need to do a lot of physical traveling to go to archives and libraries. And most people don't have the time or resources to do that. So the works that are published, have been published, about the popular arts historically have been somewhat, I think, a bit limited. But now with the ability, well, I mean, even if you got a reel of microfilm, right, and you're flipping through it, how can you find all the little tidbits and items about a cartoonist? Your eyes are going to be bleeding. And now you can just do a keyword search and the computer will turn up stuff. It's not exact, and you have to learn a lot of tricks to be able to tease these things out, but it is possible. So I tell people that the biggest challenge of writing this book was like taking all these little scraps of information and weaving them into narratives about the cartoonists in the book, and then weaving those narratives into an overall story arc about the rise and peak of the form or the sensibility of screwball in comics. And it was like building a battleship out of matchsticks. You just take all these little pieces and somehow fit them together. And, I studied Michael Tisserin's biography quite a lot I stole a lot of tricks from him, I have to admit.
Again, when something's that well crafted and paints that great a picture, yeah, there's nothing wrong with, how did he do that? Let me figure that out and apply that here. And to not repeat the same stuff with for example, with your Harriman chapter to go in different directions and such. That's the whole thing to me. It holds together really well. You manage to humanize these artists. You give us, who they are as people rather than just throwing us into their artwork first. I think it's a good approach to take with this stuff, not to just make it biography on one side or just the art, but really to fuse those this well.
Well, thank you very much. That's exactly what I was trying to do. It was important to me to humanize the artist, and to because I didn't want to just write a dry academic factual account of this stuff, like so and so did this comic strip on this date. That's hard enough to do, but I really just wanted to figure out who these people were and what happen if we can find anything in their lives that relates to their work. One of the cool things I found out, it's sad. I actually found a lot of dark things, but the guy that created Smokey Stover, his name was Bill Holman. And Smokey Stover is this really wacky, comic. If you had to pick one American newspaper comic strip that you would hold up as the epitome of the screwball sensibility, it'd probably be Smokey Stover. I found this amazing story about, I found an interview with him where he alluded to the fact that he lost his father at an early age. And so I was just like, okay, how early and what happened? And did that have any influence on his development as a cartoonist? And, I knew the chances of finding this were 1,000,000 to 1, probably if there was anything to be found. By golly, 3 days of intense research. I can't even tell you how I navigated my way through the labyrinth, but I got to the Minotaur. I found these articles about what happened to his dad. And, it turns out his father was involved in a tragic accident. And that's how that chapter starts. And The accident involved happened because his father wanted to step out of a train and take a smoking break, and he was killed. And so I found it interesting, that Bill Holman, who hadn't even been born when his father was killed, created a strip called Smokey. That's what the strip was called originally. So there's some interesting stuff, that you tease out of all this. That it was really important to me to put into the chapters and make them so that readers could connect to them. When I was really young, I read this book called Men of Mathematics by, I think his name was E.T. Bill. And you would think that a collection of essays about mathematicians would be the most boring, dry thing in the world. At least I would. I'm not really a math guy. But this book was so interesting, Gil. And that has always stuck in my mind, behind every accomplishment, behind everything that's done, whether it's a comic strip or a mathematical theorem, or, scientific experiment or whatever, there's a person. And, we may not be able to understand the mathematical formula, but we can certainly relate to the person. So that was my key to making these old weird comics accessible again to people, because they're not very accessible. They're hard to read. They don't make a lot of sense. We've lost a lot of the context. And
the visual format's a little different than
it is
what we're accustomed to. Yeah. But still, they're works of genius in, again, trapped in certain times. And in fact, that becomes an issue, particularly in the Zim chapter, the humor and stereotypes of their time, and the challenge of presenting those nowadays. Trepidation in terms of some of the ethnic horrible stereotypes that get used in some of these things.
Oh yeah, that's also a challenge when you're working with this material. I think if you're working with any of the popular arts of the 19th or early 20th century, I mean, heck, in comic strips, you could still find comic strips in the 50s that are racist. So yeah, Zim, unfortunately, it took a lot. You asked earlier about how, how the cartoonists were selected. There are a lot more screwball cartoonists, and some would be considered greater than some of the ones in this book. So the selection process was, as Art Spiegelman puts it, kind of screwy. It's not a definitive history. That needs to be written still, if it ever will be. But these are the cartoonists that I could find information on,
Sure.
and samples of their art. I mean, that was another hard part, was gathering the art. I spent so much time and money collecting this art. Mm-hmm. And, also, there were a number of factors. And I wanted to include well-known cartoonists, but also some new finds for people. And I've lost track. What did you ask me again? Oh yeah, Zim.
The racist comics. Yeah.
Yeah, the racist comics. Thank you. Yeah. So Zim's cartoons, by one estimation, about a third of his output would be racist by today's standards. And he was working with stereotypes, which most cartoonists back then did work with. You had your Irish jokes, you had your Jewish stereotype jokes, and you had your African American, and women, and you had hobos, and you had kids, and farmers. They weren't just ethnic stereotypes; they were stereotypes all over the map. And some of these today remain inoffensive, but a large number of them are offensive. So I didn't shy away from including some comics in the book that do have some offensive caricatures in them, but I didn't go out of my way to include those either. Because I wanted the book to be entertaining for modern readers. So if you'll pardon the phrase, I didn't whitewash over it.
Yeah.
But I didn't make it the centerpiece of the book.
Sure.
Another interesting thing is there are no women in the 15 chapters.
Yeah, I know. I looked at it and had that moment of my wife has asked this, when I've recorded with Jules Pfeiffer and Sam Gross and these older cartoonists, not as old as this world, of course. She asked, are there female cartoonists you could also grab who are that age? I'm like, honey, I feel terrible about this, but there weren't a lot of opportunities. And so, there just isn't someone to go grab to put on mic. Ramona Fredon or somebody like that would be great, but that's about it, for all I could come up with.
Oh man, if you could get her, that would be awesome. But I ran into this. I was very conscious of it. I considered for a long time having a chapter on a early woman cartoonist named Kate Carew.
Oh, Eddie Campbell and I talked about her. She comes up in Eddie Campbell's book, The Goat Getters, and he's actually working on a longer thing about her specifically now. So.
Oh, good. I'm glad that's getting done because I promised a relative of hers that I would do some work on it, and I haven't. But she's a fascinating figure. She interviewed, famous people of the day like Mark Twain and Pablo Picasso, and drew cartoons about them in her interviews, and she had some comic strips too. But she didn't seem to me to be. Most of her work didn't have what I would call the screwball spirit. A little bit had it somewhat, but I couldn't find enough of her material to justify an in-depth chapter. So she didn't make it in. But yeah, I mean, there very well could be. It's not that there weren't women cartoonists working in the screwball vein. In silent film comedy of the era, there certainly were many fine film comedians who had the screwball spirit, like Alice Howell. So I figured there must have been some in newspaper comics, but they were probably local, not syndicated, and that's much harder to find. They're buried, they're tucked away in little local newspapers. But someday we will excavate them.
Well, that's the tough thing. I was going to ask, you mentioned doing so much research online. Did you have to do any in-person library stuff? Did you have to get to the Billy or anything as part of the research for this one?
Oh man, I would have loved to have gotten to the Billy. I just didn't have the resources. I didn't have the money. I kept hoping maybe a publisher would, give me a contract and send me to the Billy Ireland, but they didn't. However, Dean Mullaney, my publisher of this book, my collaborator really, he goes over there for his other reprint book projects. He's the head of the Library of American Comics line published by IDW. And they reprint, Dick Tracy, Little Orphan Annie, Terry and the Pirates, and many other amazing archival reprint volumes. And a lot of that comes out of OSU's Billy Ireland library collection. And so when he was over there, he would spend a day or two gathering some material for me for the screwball book. So that was helpful. But I didn't interview anybody in person, but I did have some personal contact through the phone and emails with some family members of some of the cartoonists. Most notably for me was talking with Gus Mager's granddaughter, Judith. She was great, and she gave me some real insight into his character. And also running into the maverick filmmaker, Sam Fuller, running into his wife. Sam's not with us anymore, but his wife and daughter are. And I wound up talking with them and getting some really great art for the book from them.
Wow. So, awesome. Yeah, I was wondering with the Vingfuller side of things, if there's a little more documentation because he was later and because of the connection with his brother and his career.
That's right.
So.
Yeah, the more you come, to our present time, the more you can find, pretty much.
Right. Now, in the book, Bill Blackbeard refers to Dwig as the greatest of the American comic strips' forgotten talents. Who's your great forgotten talent? Who are you happiest to have uncovered or brought to light in this one?
Well, I love Dwig, and that's a great quote by Bill Blackbeard. I'm not sure that I agree with it. Dwig was undoubtedly a great talent. However, he I'm taking a screwball path to answering your question, so bear with me.
That's the nature of that's the nature of conversation. That's what the show's about, man. It's good.
Yeah. It's just like that's the way my mind works. It fires off in 5 different directions at once. So that's probably why I did a book of screwball stuff. Anyway, the thing about Dwig is he did this amazing comics that have a great screwball aspect to them for the first 10 or 15 years of his professional career as a cartoonist. And then something happened and he became sort of frozen in time, frozen in amber. And for the rest of his long career, all of his comic strips were nostalgic boyhood comic strips. You know, they were sort of like Huckleberry. Well, he did Huckleberry Finn and Tom Sawyer. He did an officially licensed version. I think the thing that happened in my research, which was their first child died of food poisoning when he was just about a year old. And at that time, he was doing a comic called Home Wanted by a Baby, in which a baby is the main character of that daily and Sunday comic strip. And it was probably created because he had a new baby. It was their first child. And it must have, just been heartbreaking to him to have to continue this contractual agreement to produce the strip after they lost their child. And I think that might have changed him. But in any case, the later stuff is the nostalgic boyhood stuff has a flavor, but it's a bit cloying by today's standards. And his artwork doesn't feel as great as it did in the pre boyhood strips. The artist in the book, there is a chapter on Dwig, and there's some wonderful comics in there, including some really rare color Sunday pages of Home Wanted by a Baby, which is one of the screwiest comic strip concepts I can think of. This baby puts himself in a basket on somebody's doorstep in panel 1, and he gets adopted by different people in each strip. And by the last panel, he's so put off by their character or who they are or their obsessions or what bad parents they are that he's leaving in the last panel to go find another parent. And it's a great concept. The artist that I love the most, though, the unknown artist, is probably Walter R. Bradford. He's chapter 3 in the book. And while his art style in no way compares to the beautiful, detailed drawings that Dwig draws, and that free flowing spindly line of his, Bradford's drawings are really crude, but man, his sense of humor is so funny to me. He had this great comic strip called Jingling Johnson about a crazy poet. Jingling back then was a term for the verses that you might get in a Valentine's Day card. And then later, of course, it became, sort of known as like an advertising jingle. Sure. One reviewer in a published review somewhere called him Jingling Johnson. I like that. But and Jingling Johnson, he's just this insane. He's actually crazy. I mean, he really is insane, and it's a masterful portrait of obsession. And that's sort of the key to his comics. He creates these characters that are not typified by their position in life or their ethnicity or anything like that. They're typified by their neuroses, by their behavior. So you have the Almost family, which is a family that can never be on time for anything, no matter how hard they try. Or Mrs. Rummage, the bargain fiend, who makes herself feel better by going out and buying junk, much to her husband's irritation. So, it's just brilliant stuff. He was a brilliant humorist working in the comics medium. So I'm glad to have presented him to the world. And I'm happy to say that Art Spiegelman picked up on this, too. He said he thought that was the real find in the book.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Can you talk a little about when you mentioned like great comedian who or great comic mind who happens to be making a comic, the intersection of screwball comics or screwball comic strips with vaudeville and film and the other entertainment media of the time, because the way you portray it looks like they feed back and forth into each other. Talk a little about that and how the Marx Brothers got their names, I guess.
Oh, yeah. Well, the Marx Brothers got their names from a comic strip by Gus Mager. Gus Mager had this long-running series, which, comic scholars today call it Mager's Monks, but it never really had that name. It was the name of whatever monk was in the strip. And these were humanized monkeys, an early version of funny animals. And the monkeys, like Bradford, they were built on neuroses. And so you have like Nako, the monk, who knocks everything. You can show him Niagara Falls and he just goes, tut, tut. Big deal. You can, have him look through a telescope at the Milky Way and he's not impressed. You have Rimo, who obsessively rhymes, again, poetry. And you have Groucho, who's very grouchy. And it was like a fad, sort of like when I don't know if this ever happens anymore, but for a while in the 80s and 90s, when Saturday Night Live would hit upon a great recurring sketch, it would become a tagline and everybody would be saying it for a while. Like the church lady. Yeah, exactly.
The first one that comes to mind. Pathological Liar is also good, but church lady is just so, for our era, that's so perfect.
It certainly is, isn't it? So they had their own version of that from this comic strip. People were going around putting O at the end of names and making up, nicknames for people. And so Harpo Marx, and I found out after I published the book, Groucho Marx also have really detailed accounts of getting their stage names out of the comic strip. They were having a poker game and some guy, was throwing them their whole cards. And, he's like, here's one for you, Groucho. And he was called Groucho, not because he was grouchy, but because he kept his money in a grouch bag, which I guess was a little bag, you attach somewhere on your person. Harpo, because he played the harp. Chico, because he chased the chicks. And Gummo, because he wore rubber sole shoes and snuck up on everybody. Zeppo came along later. I some connection with Zeppelins. I don't know that one, but anyway, there's an amazing cross section or cross fertilization would be the better word.
Pollination, yeah.
Cross pollination. Thank you. There it is. Between comics and early humor comics and early silent film. And actually, that is the next big project that I'm working on. It's grown organically out of doing this book and discovering all these connections. You have George Harriman working on Hal Roach's Lot of Fun, where, the great Laurel and Hardy were working before they were even a team. And he's there drawing Stumble In, which is reprinted. We get a nice section of Stumble In the book. And you have Milt Gross working in Hollywood. And you have so many cartoonists work, like Rube Goldberg. It's not well known, but he wrote and appeared in the very first Three Stooges movie called Soup to Nuts. But more than the crossovers, there was a sensibility, right? If you think about it, comics and film, cinema, were more or less born at the same moment in history. Right. And they were both driven by technological change. And in the beginning, much of it was humor. It was about humor, which grew out of, as you say, Gil, vaudeville. And that's what people did for entertainment before they went to the movies. They went and saw vaudeville. And a lot of vaudeville, was musical acts and feats of dexterity, juggling. W.C. Fields started out as a juggler. And lots of comic skits. And so it was only natural to film these comic skits and turn them into silent film comedies as we know them today. But as we know, from watching the films of people like Charlie Chaplin, the characterizations got much richer and funnier. From watching the films of someone like Buster Keaton, the films became technically dazzling, full of invention and innovation. And from watching someone like Harold Lloyd, the films were full of daring feats that were just mind-boggling and somehow funny at the same time. So they became so much richer. But in the beginning, in the early years, like in the 1900s, the filmmakers and the cartoonists were faced with the same problem, which was how do we use our forms, which are almost entirely visual and linear to make people laugh. And a lot of the same solutions were developed. And when one innovation would happen in the comics, you'd see it turn up in film and vice versa. And these guys hung out with each other. They knew each other. In fact, in the Walter Hoban chapter, there's a comic strip called Jerry on the Job, and you'll see that he's got W.C. Fields in one of his strips, a reference to him. You have Jerry trying to juggle like Whitey Fields. Now, W.C. Fields and Walter Hoban undoubtedly knew each other. They both came from Philadelphia. And I found, there's so much research I could not get into the chapters. But I found, records of the two hanging out together. And I think Hoban might have even written for some of W. Fields' vaudeville acts. So there's so much crossover, and it's a rich, rich history. And I think if you hold the two up next to each other, you will discover some interesting insights about each of the forms that we currently don't have. So this is what I intend to do. But man, this is a project. This book took 7 years. The Screwball book, writing the book about film and comics could take, I don't know how long, because there's so much work that's already been done on silent film. And getting my head wrapped around that has been quite a feet. But
the flip side is,
there.
I was going to say that the less of the more reading, less research, maybe, it might balance out in terms of, eating up the rest of your life. But we'll see how much room it needs.
Well, a lot of the research for me is watching the silent comedies, which, man, I'm suffering doing that. I'll tell you.
Have you been part of Ben Modell's silent comedy watch party?
Oh yeah, that's so wonderful that he's doing that. I love it.
We did a show years ago through one of the great fucked up moments of the podcast history where I was very much seen. Basically, I recorded with David Leopold, Al Hirschfeld's archivist.
Oh, cool!
And I was down emotionally going into that weekend. I was just having a rough time. The show wasn't going great. All sorts of stuff. David and I hit it off. We're introduced by Drew Friedman a few months earlier, which is always a good sign. But David and I hit it off so well. And at the end, he says to me, "You know who you need to interview? My friend Ben. He's a silent movie accompanist." And I'm just staring at him like, how would you know? That is exactly who I want to sit down and I wasn't even being facetious. I was like, that someone who does that, I need to sit down and talk to him. And we ended up having a great conversation.
I've heard it. It is a great conversation.
But one of the interesting things to me about it is from the first big one we had where he talked about getting into this field and all of those guys who were the second biggest guy in the world back then, 100 years ago, and therefore no one knows who in quotes, knows who they are now. Marcel Perez was the big one. And of course, people in the know who Marcel Perez is. But the idea that this was the second best known comedian in film doesn't carry a lot of cachet 100 years later. And seeing how that reputation works, how figuring out the art form as it was developing, all that stuff I find fascinating. So I'm looking forward to you working on that book too, to see how all these things intersect.
Well, you have the same thing going on with some of the cartoonists in Screwball. They were very well read in their time. Millions of people read Dwig, but try to find somebody who knows who he is today. Well, maybe after this book, a few more people will know him, but he's pretty much history has written him off.
Now, do you think we're in a golden age where it comes, you mentioned in terms of being able to research as much as we have, in terms of like reprints and collections and things that we never would have imagined would actually be being collected, much less, a book like this,
Yeah, very much so. We are definitely in a golden age of, comic reprints, and also a golden age of new comics. There are just so many emerging new cartoonists.
Without putting you on the spot, who do you read? Because you're going to forget someone and you're going to hate yourself for it afterwards.
Yeah, I hate these questions, man. Well, I have a huge stack right now of things that I'm reading and want to read. So most recently, a book that I read that I love, which is actually a reprint of comics from the 80s. It's called The Pits of Hell by Yoshiharu Suge. And shoot, I hope I got his name right. Anyway, I did a review of the comics for the Comics Journal. It's put out by Breakdown Press. Some nice blokes in London, and they're working with me on a Milk Gross book. Those comics are just insane. This is a guy who grew up in Nagasaki after the bomb was dropped, and it colored, his worldview. And but it's not serious stuff. It's the wackiest, strangest, most surreal stuff you'll run across. Really great, really great. Modern cartoonist. I mean, he's not working anymore in cartoons, so. Modern cartoonists that I enjoy would be Noah Van Sciver. Are you familiar with his work? I'm just
kidding. Noah and I, the ongoing joke is I always say who whenever anybody brings him up. But yeah, Noah's wonderful.
Yeah, exactly. Well, Al Cap in Little Abner for a long time had a running joke where Little Abner would say, gosh, I hope I'll become a cartoonist, a great cartoonist like Walt Kelly or Ving Fuller. And Daisy May would always say, who's Ving Fuller? But then later he changed it to say, who's Walt Kelly? But yeah, Noah Van Sciver stuff is amazing. I think he's just a born cartoonist. And he works he's really interesting because he's developing multiple levels to his work. He started out sort of doing these autobiographical comics, but then he morphed into doing historically based comics, like with the great graphic novel about Abraham Lincoln's early years as a melancholic called The Hypo, for hypochondriac. And then he's now integrating nature into his drawing in the most beautiful and astounding way. You have these pages of bushes and trees and skyscapes, and it seems to reflect on the characters, and it somehow makes the whole thing a deeper and richer reading experience. So it's been fascinating to follow his progress. In Seattle, there are a number of amazing cartoonists. I'm in Seattle.
I was going to say, you're in the middle of what's still a vibrant cartooning community decades after it started in the late 80s.
Yeah, throw a custard pie and you'll hit a cartoonist here in Seattle. And, some of my favorites on the scene are Max Clotfilter. Don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he had a couple of pages in the 2019 Best of American Comics anthology. He does, I did a review of a book on Basil Wolverton for the Comics Journal, and I included a review of one of Max's comics too, because I see a lineage there from Basil Wolverton to Max. So he's sort of a modern day Wolverton in that he's obsessed with cross-hatching. He'll lay down acres and acres of cross-hatching and minute detail. But he's definitely got a 21st century sensibility in his work. Comes from the South, like I do too. I'm from Louisiana. And Max is from Georgia. And I appreciate the Southern humor that's in his work too. But there's a lot of great cartoonists, but those are a few.
Gotcha. And just being in Seattle in terms of, both the comic side and just, having a sort of arts culture around you, how important is that?
Actually, it's weird. I'm not that connected. Like, I'm about 10 minutes away from the office of Fantagraphics, which, in case anybody doesn't know, it's probably the leading American publisher of cartoons. I think they call themselves the publishers of the world's greatest cartoonist. And those guys basically won't give me the time of day. They don't know who I am. Even though I write for the Comics Journal online, that's run by a group of fellows in New York City. So, and it's fine. It's fine. They have their projects and I have mine. I am plugged into the local comics scene, and I have done articles about these people. And for a while, I pitched to Gary Roth the idea of doing a book about the Seattle comics scene, through a little historical, but also a little current. But he wasn't interested. And Yeah, so I've moved on to studying cartoonist of 100 years ago. And it's neat, though, because the people in the comics community support my work. They like it. They like understanding the lineage, and they appreciate, even if they don't read these older comics or have much of an appreciation for them, they like that someone is digging this stuff up, right, and giving attention to these cartoonists who are more or less forgotten. Some of them, anyway.
And to get back to Screwball itself, the transition, the type of comedy, the type of comic still exists, but they migrate from newspapers to magazines where you get, Mad and Humbug and things like that, and then into especially the underground comics, coming in the 60s and 70s. What do you think accounts for the migration out of the newspaper side and into these other forms?
Yeah, that's a very astute question, Gil. Well, what I see, your tracking is on target, but there's one that's missing, which is comic books.
Yes.
So you have, society's popular culture changed after World War II radically in America, and that sort of innocent silliness, that embrace of nonsense, that goes back to books like Alice in Wonderland and Edward Lear's nonsense poems, and then resonates throughout these comic strips. It seems to kind of become passé. And, now you have the emergence of film noir and a darker, more tense world reflected in our popular culture. And there's not really a place for the Marx Brothers or Gene Ahern's The Squirrel Cage in this world anymore. But also comics, as everybody knows who's studied comics, the newspaper comics began to give less and less real estate to comic strips. They crowded them together on one page and then began to try to cram more and more on there. And so you can only do so much. That's part of the genius of Charles Schulz's Peanuts, was that it was immediately readable, or a comic strip like Ernie Bushmiller's Nancy.
I was just going to say, Karasik and Newgarden had that great line, I think from Spiegelman, that it's tougher not to read Nancy than to read Nancy when you see it on a page.
Yeah, yeah, exactly.
It's just there, you're instantly going to read it,
Yeah, the time it takes you to decide whether or not you want to read it, you've read it. So they're almost like they just jump off the page into your eyes, and Peanuts and Nancy and so many other comics. And that's the form that we're at now. There's not, like a strip like Mutts actually draws on Harriman's sense of humor. And of course, the author of that strip did the first great book on biography on Harriman, Patrick McDonnell. And, but there aren't many comics in the newspapers that have any screwball sensibility. Zippy the Pinhead is one by Bill Griffith, and maybe Bizarro by Dan Ferraro. So what happened, and you can see it in the last chapters of Screwball. I included Ving Fuller as chapter 14, and then a cartoonist named Gordon Booty Rogers. Love that name, Booty.
Oh, yeah. I love your attempt at justifying where he got the name from.
Yeah. He said it was because he could boot the football, but I don't think so. Yeah. Anyway, he's the last chapter. And so these two guys are examples of cartoonists who grew up during the heyday of screwball comics, and they obviously identified with that sensibility and decided they would focus on it in their work. And this is at a time when you had cartoonists like Rube Goldberg, going back to like 1915. There are articles in the paper about Rube Goldberg's salary. It was newsworthy because it was so high. He made so much money. He was the first millionaire cartoonist. And this became an inspiration to others, and like Seagar, for example. And so you have some latecomers like Fuller and Rogers. And man, it was tough for these guys. You can see them working so hard to get a syndicated comic strip and just not really scoring that well. So Booty Rogers he had a brief run of a comic strip called Sparky Watts, which we're really lucky to find some and get them reprinted in the book in a nice chunk. But after that, he worked in comic books. And so I think, and if you study the biographies of Basil Wolverton that have come out by Greg Sadowski, which are amazing, just recently from Fantagraphics, you see that Basil started out submitting comic strips to syndicates and getting turned down. And suddenly comic books explode. Jack Cole started out wanting to be a magazine gag cartoonist, and he couldn't make enough money. So he starts finding work in comic books where they're beginning to really catch on, and there's just plenty of work. And that's where all the cartoonists went in the late 1930s and early 40s, most of them anyway. If you didn't go into the New Yorker, or become a cartoonist for Collier's or Life, you became a comic book artist. And a lot of these guys tried to get syndicated comic strips, and most of them didn't. So then you have magazines like, Mad started out as a comic book. The first 23 issues were a comic book, and then it becomes a magazine. And then you have many knockoffs of Mad. And in a way, this whole book is an attempt to understand what the lineage of Mad is, by the way. I sort of regard Mad, which came along in 1952, I believe, as the apex of screwballism in comic books or in comics. And this gives you the backstory to Mad. That's a good way to look at this book.
Yeah, there was, oh God, I forget who the artist is. I'm looking through the PDF right now of, it must have been the Bill Holman chapter. There were segments of it that I thought, this is looking a lot like Harvey Kurtzman and Will Elder, like some of the elephant charging through. And then later in the chapter, you make a couple of Kurtzman references. I'm like, oh, thank God. Okay, I'm not misreading this. This is something that's informing those guys.
That was definitely very astute of you to pick up on that. Including all that stuff in the background. Will Elder famously called it chicken fat. All those background gags, it was like the globules of chicken fat floating on top of the soup, which gave it the flavor. It's kind of a disgusting term, but I guess it works.
For Jews, this is how we do stuff. The schmaltz.
Yeah, there you go. So there's another book to be written there somewhere. But all those background gags, you can find those going back to the 1900s in comic strips like Kelly's Kindergarten by Richard Otcult or School Days by Dwig, which is, we have some reprints of School Days. And, best of all, Mrs. Bump's Boarding House. There's a wonderful Mrs. Bump's Boarding House Sunday, which is just loaded with background gags. I mean, I count like 30 background gags, or chicken fat gags, if you will. Yeah. So that influenced Bill Holman, right? And then Bill Holman influences Harvey Kurtzman. Kurtzman wrote an introduction to a collection of Bill Holman's cartoons in which he said that. He said, did all those little tchotchkes in the background influence us to include them in Mad? Yes. So there you go.
There's
it's
never
a direct
point denying
lineage.
this stuff. Yeah.
Right.
And that's what I found interesting. Even the contemporaries, the way they influence one another, given, what we know about newsrooms and newspapers, et cetera, these guys all hung together generally. They moved from Hearst to Pulitzer's, et cetera, for the various newspapers. But it wasn't like they were all off the way we think of cartoonists nowadays, hiding out in their homes, drawing. And these guys were social beings and, could see each other's work daily as it was evolving.
They were very social. They had, especially in New York City where most of them were, that's where you pretty much had to go if you wanted to become a successful cartoonist in the first half of the 20th century in America. And they had all these societies they belonged to, the Kit Kat Club, I guess it was called. I can't remember now. The Lambs Club, the Friars Club, the Society for Illustrators, on and on and on. And they would have all, the National Cartoonist Society. They would have all these dinners and all get together and play jokes on each other. And I would love to have been, if I had a time machine, man, I would definitely go check out some of that stuff. But another thought too, something you said there about cartoonists being cloistered away, it occurs to me that the much of the world now understands what it's like to live as a cartoonist.
That's most of the cartoonists I've spoken to have said, they've been ready for this moment all their lives because of their social isolation. Mm-hmm. Only one of them, the one I posted today as we're talking, Kyla Roberts, she had some health issues, so I was worried about her throughout this. Mm. And it turns out she's like, I'm having the time of my life. I don't have to drive my kid to practices or anything. Like all the things that were wearing me down and exacerbating my health condition, those are all gone. I'm home drawing comics and my kid doesn't hate me. This is great. So everybody else, we've all got issues, but of all people, she turns out to be having a pretty good pandemic, which gets me to my last question though. How are you coping? How is pandemic life for you?
Well, thank you for that question. I first just want to say I'm really happy to hear that a cartoonist is doing well in this time. I'm actually on a medical leave from my own job right now due to stress. Yeah, the stress has been pretty bad. It's sort of indirectly related to COVID-19, although. I think everybody's stress level is up because we're in the middle of a pandemic. But aside from that, there was sort of a slowdown of business at my company. And they decided in the interim to have me do some projects. And the projects turned out to be really complicated. And it completely changed the structure of my working life. And being isolated away from my team and my coworkers and having all this pressure, it just put me over the top. So I'm having these periods of extreme fatigue and exhaustion. And I'm extremely caffeinated right now to be able to do this interview with you.
Well, I appreciate it then. Okay. I moderate my caffeine intake throughout the day, so I'm always, staying at a certain charged level. But
well, you sound right on it, spot on today.
Yeah, I have optimized the living shit out of that formula. I've really pulled it off for my own needs. I explained one of my past guests just hit me up because he was here for Thanksgiving, and I made coffee afterwards for dessert for everybody. And he wrote me, he's like, do you mind sharing some of the secrets of your coffee regimen? And I've been waiting for this moment my entire life, and sent him this breakdown of exactly the second by second formula I use for making coffee and how it distributes over the day. But yeah, that's me and my obsessions. That's what I get for not drinking or having a social life. But
I'm going to hit you up, through email to get your secret. Cause I'm pretty much just intravenous. Just drink it all the time.
Yes, it's a question of how much you can take before your system collapses, and
that's right. That point, exactly.
Just staying under it.
Yeah. That's the trick. Yeah.
Yeah. But as far as living in Seattle, particularly, given that was the early hotspot for all this, did that really exacerbate the?
Yeah. For a while, as I'm sure most of, if not all your listeners know, Seattle was the epicenter in the beginning of the spread to the United States. Although it turns out now they found that it started in other places as well. But at that time, in all the news, it was like, it's in Seattle, and the predictions were quite dire, and it became pretty nutty. As it has in other parts of the country, but it started, we were the first wave. So we had, empty shelves in the grocery store, and, no toilet paper to be found anywhere. And I was a little worried about coffee, to tell you the truth. So I must admit, I bought some.
I subscribe to 3 different coffee services now.
The
coffee delivery thing. I only had one previously. I've added 2 other. There's currently 4 pounds of coffee sitting in my kitchen and garage at this point, just in case one of them goes under, I'll have 2 other sources. Plus there's a roaster 2 towns over I can drive out to. They're still functioning. New York and New Jersey are just a nightmare now. And
oh yeah,
you guys were the precursor for this stuff, especially culturally, what it meant to lock everything down like that. But
I'm proud of the city. I think, by and large, enough people in the city have practiced social distancing to, flatten the curve out even better than what they thought we could do. And so we're being held up as a model now. So I myself have been very isolated. But hey, I'm sort of like a cartoonist. I'm a writer, which is real similar. So I work from home already. I work remotely. And so it's not a big change for me, except that the few social things that I would do on a regular basis, like having lunch with my 20-year-old son every Friday, are no longer possible. And losing those has really tipped the scale for me. I don't need to socialize much. I'm pretty much I am an extroverted personality, but I'm also antisocial.
I'm 100% with you. Trust me. I get exactly what you're saying. So yeah.
Yeah, I come up that way on the Myers-Briggs. So, but I'm realizing how important those minimal social encounters are. Like another great Seattle cartoonist who I should have mentioned, whose work I love, is David Lasky. Are you familiar with David Lasky?
He did one of the all-time greatest comics of the 90s, an issue of Boom Boom that retold the life of James Joyce, but every page with a pastiche of a Jack Kirby classic
I know. Isn't
comic.
that great?
And that one I was like, that's a fucking work of genius. Combining those two, so I've never corresponded directly with David, but yeah, I know his work.
Oh, well, he would be a great person to interview.
And now that I'm doing these remotes,
Yeah, well, he's a neighbor of mine. And we get together for coffee regularly, but we can't do that now. And I'm really missing that, it is different right now, even though I am pretty isolated to begin with. What about you? Are you, starting to long for social connection?
No, see, that's the funny thing. I had no social life prior to this. I had the podcast. I'm not even joking. That's the sad thing. I barely talk to my family. I talk to no one except my wife and my dog. And my dog doesn't talk back too much. And so when this all got rolling, I started with the doing the daily podcast check-ins with past guests, ostensibly to see how they're doing. But the real reason is I liked talking to someone for 20 to 30 minutes who doesn't ultimately have to be disappointed by me. So if they just get a little of the Gil Roth experience, and then, they don't have to hear from me again, that works. As far as I'm concerned, I haven't disappointed or let anyone down. We had a nice conversation, and I got to find out how they're doing and not have to talk too much about myself.
Well, I'll tell you, Gil, I play your podcast regularly. I play it when I'm working. There's parts of my work, my graphic design work, where I don't need to be thinking too intensely, and I can actually focus on, like a podcast. And I really love the Virtual Memory Show. And I'm not just saying that.
I appreciate that. Thanks.
I discovered it when you first interviewed Michael Tisserand, but then I went back and listened to all the shows. And
that was immediately before the great Thomas Dolby episode. I think it was Michael and then Thomas Dolby, and I thought that's a nice back-to-back combination.
That was amazing.
But yeah, artists and cartoonists always tell me it's when they're inking, and again, same thing when they're doing the less thinky stuff. They love having these sorts of conversations going on.
That's right. I can't do it when I'm writing, but I can do it when I'm designing.
Yeah, I'm the same way with music in general. Also, if there's words, I cannot focus on anything.
Exactly.
But the question I meant to ask, besides the pandemic thing, your sense of humor and what brought you towards Screwball, a result of growing up in Louisiana, or is there some other factor? My wife is from rural Louisiana, so
she is okay. Well, I was born and raised in Baton Rouge, and then moved to Alexandria and Pineville, but I have family down in Morgan City, which is way down south of Louisiana, where the Cajuns are. But in a way it did, because I was so damn bored as a kid growing up there. There wasn't, I was born in 1962. We had, 2 television channels, and all my relatives liked playing country music, which I love now, but back then I thought was corny. I was a big snob back then. And I read Smokey Stover in the papers, but I loved comic books. That was my savior, comic books and books, reading. My father was a librarian. I'll never forget the time my dad came home from the library. Somebody had donated a stack of those great Pogo paperbacks that they published from the 50s, that have those nice textured covers. And they're just beautiful little paperback reprints of the Pogo comic strips. And someone had donated a tall stack of them, and he came home and he distributed them like riches on my bed to me and my mother. because she loved it too. And for weeks, all we, like at the dinner table, we were all just reading Pogo books. So I was heavily influenced by my parents who read comics. My mother loved Little Lulu by John Stanley. And,
Did they take some responsibility for where your career ended up? I'm just kidding. That's
actually, unfortunately, they died a while back, so they never got to see this fruition. I think they'd be very pleased and proud. I did publish. I for a while I was attempting to be a science fiction writer, and they did take a lot of pride when I got published that way. Cool. But my mother always felt like my strength was as a nonfiction writer, and dang it, I hate to say, she may have been right.
There's a thing where we realize they knew a lot more than we thought they knew.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
About us in particular.
Definitely. Yeah. Oh, and you mentioned that your dog doesn't talk back. It reminded me of the great James Thurber joke, which is a cartoon, which is, or actually I think it's in one of his stories, but a character has given his dog a nervous breakdown because he keeps going up to him and saying, "If you're a police dog, where's your badge?"
I just figure who's a good boy probably fills up with dread and anxiety. But
yeah, exactly.
Am I a good boy? I don't even know. That's
The best dog comic, by the way, if you want to read one to really crack you up and you don't know it already, is Dorman's Doggy by Fulbert Sturgeon or Frank Stack.
Oh, I remember the name, but I never read those. Yeah,
those appeared in first in Arcade, and then there was a collection of them. Well worth seeking out. They're so damn funny.
Nice. I'll have to take a look. I'm so glad that Screwball exists because it just opened me up to a whole ton of artists. Even the guys like the Rube Goldberg chapter, you focus on the non-Rube Goldberg stuff.
Right.
The world you open up through this has just been it's been a fantastic discovery. So.
It's been a fantastic discovery for me, to dig around and find out about all this stuff. And I wanted to communicate that excitement and that opening up to other people. And, there's just a lot more good stuff out there than we realized. For a long time, comics history were all about the heavy hitters like the George Harrimans and the E.C. Segars and, the Chester Goulds and Harold Gray. Winsor McCay, of course. Yeah. And they deservedly, rightfully own that place in the top tier. But there is a heck of a lot of other good stuff out there that's well worth our time. And it is incredible to me that this stuff is only 100, 120 years old. And as a society, we have completely forgotten about it. So it's a real lost treasure. We rightfully should have, the collected works of Rube Goldberg should be in print. The collected works of Frederick Opper should be a multi-volume set in print available. These are treasures of American culture and American arts, and they're still waiting to be discovered. So hopefully this book might ignite a little bit of interest in, future people who may create those collections someday.
I will do everything I can to push it. Paul, thanks so much for coming on, man.
Yeah, thank you. It's been great.
And that was Paul C. Tumey. Check out his new book, Screwball, The Cartoonists Who Made the Funnies Funny, from IDW Publishing. As you could tell from the conversation, I enjoyed it a heck of a lot. Paul's got a lot of different blogs, including screwballcomics.blogspot.com and his Jack Cole one, but none of them are updating regularly at this point, so you should probably go check out his Instagram, which is Paul C. Tumey, to see what he's up to. And that's PaulCTumey. And there'll be a link to that in the show notes for this episode. Now, after we wrapped, I did not ask him, so who you've been reading, but we might record a follow-up about that sometime soon. I need to get started on the next quarterly patron-only bonus podcast, Fear of a Square Planet, where my past guests answer that question. The fourth quarter 2019 episode is up, and I've got to get to work on the first quarter 2020. That 4Q one, though, features more than an hour of book recommendations and fun conversation with Chris Ware, Witold Rybczynski, Kate LaCour, Liz Hand, Frank Santoro, Hoche Anderson, Kevin Huizenga, Stephen Heller, Pete Bagg, Ed Ward, Annie Koyama, Rob Armstrong, Edie Nadelhaft, and Peter Cooper. You can support the Virtual Memories Show via patreon.com/VMSpod or paypal.me/VMSpod. I've got all sorts of goals and goodies in place for patrons, including that podcast, patron-only blog, handwritten show notes for every episode, my secret project, which is a zine called Haiku for Business Travelers, which I might start working on those days I take off from the podcast, and more. So go to patreon.com/VMSpod and support the art of fine conversation. Although, really, as I've been saying in the daily COVID check-in podcasts, I'm getting by okay. Even with the added $20 a month of remote recording with Zencastr, $5 bump in the monthly storage at my podcast host to accommodate all the daily episodes. All that stuff is more than offset by the lack of parking, tolls, subway rides, etc. that I was doing for all the in-person episodes before. More to the point, I have a job that supports me just fine. So if you have some money to spare, don't put it in my Patreon. Don't support the art of fine conversation with money, but send me a nice email because I do appreciate that sort of stuff. Instead, give it to other people's Patreons, GoFundMes, Kickstarters, tip jars, Indiegogos, whatever. Donate to charities, maybe kick into your local food bank, do something. A lot of people and institutions are in need. I'm doing okay. If you can spare some money, go help where you can. Our music for this episode is Fella by Hal Mayforth, used with permission from the artist. You should visit my archives to check out my episode with Hal from the summer of 2018 and learn more about his art and painting. And you can listen to his music at soundcloud.com/Mayforth. And that's MAY4TH. And that's it for this week's episode of the Virtual Memories Show. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back next week with another great conversation. You can subscribe to the Virtual Memories Show and download past episodes at the iTunes Store. You can also find all our episodes and get on our email list at either of our websites, vmspod.com or chimeraobscura.com/VM. You can also follow the Virtual Memories Show on Twitter and Instagram at VMSpod, at virtualmemoriespodcast.tumblr.com, and on YouTube, Spotify, and TuneIn.com by searching for Virtual Memories Show. And if you like this podcast, please tell your pals, talk it up on social media, and go to iTunes, look up the Virtual Memories Show, and leave a rating and maybe a review for us. It all goes to helping us build a bigger audience. Now, you've been listening to the Virtual Memories Show. I'm your host, Gil Roth. Keep reading, keep making art, and keep the conversation going.